First of all, I'd like to say that I'm really very grateful to have received this invitation to come again to Dublin and to the Institute of International European Affairs. This is not my first time, indeed, here. I have very good memories of our first conference some years ago, and several visits to Dublin I've been making for several purposes. It's always a pleasure. Let me tell you that I have a special connection with Ireland, not only because when we were starting with the Lisbon Strategy, the Irish public audience was very much in line with this agenda at that time, but also because of the Lisbon Treaty, because I had the opportunity to take part of the team in charge of negotiation the Lisbon Treaty in 2007, at a time with the Portuguese presidency. And so the Lisbon Treaty was also something dear to my mind. And of course now I'm very happy that in Ireland there is such a commitment with the Lisbon Treaty. So that's why to explain to you why I have such a special connection with the Irish debate and Irish audience. But today I'm coming to speak about the new strategy for the next 10 years. So this is the successor of the Lisbon Agenda, and this will be called EU 2020 Agenda. I'm just coming from Brussels. I'm on my way to go to Lisbon this evening. This is a normal travel for me. And I will present where we are in this preparation of the EU 2020 strategy. We are indeed in a crucial moment because we had the first European Council defining the main lines of the strategy, but we are in the run-up to the June European Council, which will be the decisive one. So the June European Council will shape the European strategy for growth and jobs for the next 10 years. So this is indeed a decisive one. Let me also tell you that, taking into account the current circumstances, I'm also planning to say something about economic governance, Eurozone, the situation we are having now, because this is so timely that, of course, I cannot avoid to make a comment about that. It would be a bit strange that I would not make it. So we should be also prepared for that. In any case, let me just tell you what is my assessment of what should be this strategy, building on my own experience of the last 10 years. It was a quite long story. I was involved in preparing many European councils, many councils of ministers. I'm traveling around Europe about this, but also outside of Europe, in many continents, because in the meantime, many other countries, third countries, were really interested on this experience. China and Japan and India and Brazil and the United States. So this is already a long story. And what I will tell you now is based on the assessment of my own experience. First point I'd like to make is about the challenges. Because, well, we know that when we start to define a strategy, the first point is to identify clearly the challenges. And what we have now is that the challenges we have, some of them are the same we had in 2000, but they are just bigger. And some of them are new challenges. Some of them were already there. This is the case of globalization, but we now have a more complex global picture because we have clearly a multipolar world, and the competitors regarding Europe are now much more diversified, so this is new. We also had another challenge in 2000, which is still there, called aging trends, but now we can say they are deeper, so the aging change in our societies is deeper. And we have new challenges, particularly climate change, which will have deep implications for the upcoming strategy, because we need to change the way we produce, the way we consume, the way we move. So this really means a quite important change of way of life. And finally, we have a fourth challenge, which is still there, I believe, which is this unprecedented financial and economic crisis. We could overcome a recession, a deep recession. We are in a recovery, but the recovery is still a fragile one. And more recently, we are having developments concerning the so-called sovereign debt, which is translating into new challenges, particularly for the Eurozone. So this is, I believe, a new development of this crisis, and I will make some comments about that in the end of my my presentation, and then we can perhaps debate if you want. Let me also underline that I think it's better to consider that this crisis is really a special one, because this was a global crisis. This is a crisis dealing with the financial system, but with implications for the whole economic activity, and more recently for employment and the social dimension. So we can see the crisis also as a kind of process. It started in the financial sector, then it spread all over the economic activity. It was possible to control the crisis with an exceptional public intervention, coordinated at European level and global level. Thanks to that, it was possible to avoid that this recession turned into a kind of depression. So this danger we could avoid. But we cannot say completely that the crisis is overcome. It was controlled, is still controlled, but not completely overcome. So we are still defining the strategy for a sound and lasting recovery. And that's why this discussion on what should be the EU 2020 strategy is also relevant. Because this means that, on one hand, we are defining our priorities for the next 10 years, but on the other hand, we are also discussing on how launching a more effective recovery process. So, and we are here now. If we see all the discussions in the European Council, Council of Ministers, European Parliament, and of course at the national level, we are discussing two things at the same time. Our long-term strategy, but also the best way to make the recovery process. So let me give you my personal opinion, first of all, on what should be the goal, the strategic goal. Because we are now concluding that if we just say growth, this is perhaps not enough. Prosperity is more than growth. This is one of the conclusions we are drawing from the international debates. We had recently a remarkable research on the foundations of well-being in our societies, and we are coming to the conclusion that if we just try to increase growth rate, this is not necessarily the best choice for well-being, for prosperity, because we are understanding there is a connection between growth and environmental sustainability, and we should take care of sustainable development. If our growth is translated into worse environmental conditions, much worse environmental conditions, we'll have a problem, particularly regarding climate change. So this means that we should look not only to the level, to the rate of growth, but to the quality of growth. And we should look to the different dimensions of well-being. Well-being has to do certainly with more economic resources, but has also to do with environmental quality, with access to security, with access to education, to social protection, and more generally to conditions to perform citizenship. So these are the dimensions, basically, of well-being. So this means that if we are now designing a long-term strategy, we should define the priorities which go in this direction of more well-being and not just more growth. So this is the first conclusion. That's why you have a very interesting decision which is almost now adopted by the European Council on the main targets for the future. They are few, so they are quite focused. One has to do with employment rate, another one with access to education, another one with reducing poverty rate. The other one is the famous 20-20-20 targets regarding climate change. And then you have a final one on the need to increase the investment in research and innovation. So you see, even the targets which are being chosen try to capture these different dimensions of well-being, and they are not only limited to the growth rate. Interestingly enough, the European Council was not able, so far, let's see what will happen, to agree on a target for growth rate. Let's see what will happen. So far, they are agreeing on the targets I just mentioned to you. But then, of course, we need to discuss about the strategic priorities. And here we should be very clear, building on the previous experience. We are keeping a strong priority for innovation, research, education. For a very simple reason, is because they are indeed the main engine for growth and jobs. They are the main wealth of nations. So this core message we already had for the Lisbon strategy is being kept for the next strategy. But let me tell you something clear about that. I'm sure that an Irish audience understands this particularly well. When we speak about innovation, we should not speak only for an elite of companies or people or regions. Innovation should be for all kinds of companies, big and small, for all kinds of people, for all kinds of regions. So this means that we need to adapt the instruments of innovation policy to these different target groups. Another important point is that innovation is not only about technology. This is about organization, management, people, creative people, skills. And another important point is that if you want to foster innovation, you need to combine supply-side policies with demand-side. The most successful countries in innovation, and I consider that Ireland is among them in Europe, have always combined instruments coming from the supply side, demand side. This is a powerful combination. Then we have a second priority, which is the priority for green growth. Not only smart growth, but green growth. This has to do with this climate change issue, but this means that if we are going for green growth, this means profound changes in our transport system, our housing conditions, our cars, in the transport system particularly, but also in the everyday products we are consuming, because they should become greener products. And we now know that if we really want to have this big transformation, we need to make sure that the prices of renewable energies will be more appealing than the prices of non-renewable energies. So at the end of the story, we need to change the relative prices to encourage people to shift from non-renewable to renewable energies. And so this is not an easy change, easy shift to organize, but this is a central one. And finally, we have a third priority, which is about an inclusive growth. So the social dimension of growth, where again here we have this focus on more jobs, but also better jobs, tackling poverty and ensuring that our social protection systems are sustainable. All of these are huge challenges now in Europe, also because we are still recovering from a difficult crisis. So let me give an example. There is this concern with attracting more people into the labor market, raising the employment rate. This is very important because if you raise the employment rate, you have more people contributing to social protection systems. This is for sure a good direction. But let me tell you my opinion about that. If you want to attract more people into the labor market, we also need to create more jobs. So we need to walk with the two legs, attracting more people on one hand, but fostering job creation. And now this is particularly important in a time of fragile recovery, because if we don't foster jobs creation, in the end we'll have more unemployment. So this is not easy to coordinate. That's why I'd like to tell you something about the economic policy which should underline this strategy. The EU 2020 strategy will have three main priorities. One for smarter growth, another for greener growth, another one for inclusive growth. This is quite clear now. This was adopted in the European Council. But now there is also a decisive discussion on the economic policies we need to adopt to make sure that this strategy will be implemented. Because let me also be very frank, I think that when we compare now this new strategy with the Lisbon Strategy, the Lisbon Strategy, from my viewpoint, cannot be considered a failure. It was indeed very useful, first, to create a new strategic consensus in Europe, to tackle globalization, to make globalization an opportunity. It was useful to redirect many policies at national level, European level, but it was not possible to implement it at the level we'd like to have. So there was an implementation gap, from my viewpoint. And the reason for that is that we were missing stronger political and financial instruments to implement. That's why, if you want to make sure that the next strategy will be more effective than the previous one, we need to introduce stronger political and financial instruments. So let me conclude to speak exactly about that, because as a matter of fact, the European Council is also now discussing exactly that. All governments now are confronted with a central problem, which is how can they make recovery, a successful recovery, and at the same time to make fiscal consolidation. Because they have, most of them, higher levels of public debt and public deficit. So the problem is, in a way or another, in all member states. It's not easy to combine recovery with fiscal consolidation, but I think this is possible. And it's very important to make clear choices about that. From my viewpoint, first of all, we need to give priority to investment, to public and private investment, and to job creation. This is one of the best ways to support growth, but also to make fiscal consolidation. Because if we have more people in employment, we have more people able to contribute to the budget, to the public budget. The second priority is about encouraging member states to redirect their budgets to these new priorities of investment. We need indeed to invest for greener growth, for smarter growth. We need to invest in broadband, in energy infrastructures, in education, in better social infrastructures. So member states should be encouraged to redirect their budgets in this direction. There is a third point which has to do with tax policy. I will not speak about the level of tax policy because I consider this is a matter of a national decision, but I'm speaking about relative priorities in tax policy. And now we have a very interesting discussion on the need to move tax burden to new sources, particularly carbon taxation and financial taxation, as an alternative to labor taxation. Because labor taxation in a situation like that is, can be counterproductive. It will be hinder job creation, and ultimately can be a problem of social fairness. So we need to identify new sources of taxation if there is a need to increase taxes. And in this case, if we move to carbon taxation, just to give an example, it will be easier if there is some coordination at European level. Otherwise, we can have a kind of unbalanced situation across the European Union. That's why you see the last document adopted by the European Commission is proposing exactly that. So to have a shift of the tax burden, but should be as much as possible the coordinated one. Then we have a final point about how can we recover and at the same time make fiscal consolidation. This is about coordination in the European Union, coordination of economic policies, and particularly coordination inside the Eurozone. And when I'm speaking about coordination, I'm speaking about coordination for fiscal consolidation, but also coordination for recovery. So we need both kinds of coordination. That's why it's particularly important that the last European Council decided to launch this debate, and the Council gave a mandate to the European Commission and to the President of the Council to make proposals in this direction. How can we improve economic coordination? How can we improve economic governance, particularly in the Eurozone? Last point, and I will conclude like that because then we can move to the part of the debate. The last point is, in parallel, we were confronted with a new problem in the Eurozone, dealing with the risk of sovereign default. We have a particular case, which is the so-called the Greek case. We are having news very rarely. Even today we have an important information regarding a new plan adopted by the Greek government and announced it today. Let me tell you my general viewpoint about this problem. I think that we need to deal with this problem combining two principles. One principle is the principle of responsibility, fiscal responsibility. All member states, and particularly the members of the Eurozone, of course, they are, and they should be fiscally responsible. And to make sure they can control their public debts and their public deficits. This is a basic rule regarding the membership of the Eurozone. So if there are problems of lack of control, they need to take measures. But beyond that, we have seen over the last weeks something which, from my viewpoint, goes beyond that. Is the risk of some fragilities being exploited by specialized actors in the financial market in order to speculate against the risk of sovereign default. And these, from my viewpoint, should not be accepted by the Eurozone. The Eurozone should be organized in order to avoid these kind of situations. The Eurozone should have a mechanism to respond quickly, clearly to this kind of pressures. They are just unacceptable. And we see that they are really counterproductive, because all of a sudden, if we have an unbalanced budget, the budget will become even more unbalanced because of these speculative pressures. And I believe that if there is a clear and quick response, we can control this risk. So the European Council has decided in this direction, exactly combining the two principles, responsibility and solidarity. Now we are in crucial days to implement this commitment. It seems to me that the Greek government is making a very important effort, and the European institutions are now taking the steps to make final decisions. And it seems that we'll have over the next 2-3 days important talks at the level of ECOFIN. So let's see. I would like not to anticipate, but my general opinion about the situation is that we need to combine these two principles. I will conclude like that. Let me just finalize before opening our debate, telling you something about what will happen over the next months regarding EU 2020 strategy. Between now and June, we'll have an extremely intensive discussion about the guidelines, the economic guidelines and the employment guidelines, which will define this strategy in detail. This discussion will take place in many meetings of Council of Ministers, of Finance, of Employment, of Education, of Research, of Competitiveness. And finally, after also an opinion to be provided by the European Parliament, these guidelines will be adopted by the European Council, hopefully in June. Once they will be adopted, we'll move to a new stage, very important for all countries, for Ireland too, which should be to prepare the national reform programs. So Ireland, as all the other member states, will be invited to prepare a national reform program for the next years, something to be prepared over the next months after June. Hopefully, this will be an opportunity to have more debates at national level on what should be the concrete priorities for this program. The method of discussion is, of course, up to each member state, but the general sense coming from the European Council is that this is a good opportunity to deepen European citizenship. And that's why a debate like that, a preliminary debate like the one we are having today, is also a good move in this direction. Many thanks for your attention, and now I'm at your disposal.